Hi. In today's lesson, I thought we'd just get going a bit more on the technical and why it's so important. As you probably know, I'm a great advocate of Langford's basic photography and Langford's advanced photography. So just to talk a bit more about those, first of all, the first thing to say is that I think is an important point is self-motivation as a photographer, and really it begins with dealing with the technical. There's lots of things in here that perhaps some people might struggle to tackle as far as the technical side is concerned, but it is really important to get this technique, this knowledge about particular aspects of photography under your belt. I mean, self-motivation is something in itself that as photographers we need to take on board, force ourselves with. Motivation, as independent image makers, as independent business people, independent artists, it is about making you do these things and getting on and realising the benefits of them. And certainly as far as the technical side of it is concerned, there's enormous benefit. Over the years, I have come across quite a few practicing professionals that have said that they've never really got to grips with the technical aspects of photography, and they've admitted themselves how much of a handicap that's been. I mean, I liken it to example, for example, say if you're, like a carpenter or somebody that, a stonemason or perhaps a sculptor or someone that has a craft, and craft is a good word as well. I mean, I like to refer to photography as a craft. Well, part of gaining your craft is learning your techniques. It's learning your tools and understanding them. So that's your cameras, your lenses. Light is a tool. It's something that you work with. So if you speak to the great, for example, some of the best cinematographers, the best DOPs, that work with light, all of them will tell you that they have done their homework. They understand about the principles of light and how light works and how it reacts in different situations. So absolutely, I mean, us as photographers, we must get these concepts and these ideas. We must get them under our belt and learn and understand these concepts and ideas. I mean, I guess in some ways I often like to think of different analogies. So perhaps if you take the analogy of maybe like a musician, a guitarist, for example, learning the chords, learning the notes, etc. And one day you'll be able to play, a whole song or play impromptu. For me, it always feels the same with photography. Is that once I learnt all the nuts and bolts and all the different nuances and all the different techniques and technical things, then I really felt that I could freely create and freely be able to practice my craft, basically. So just referring quickly to Langford's basic photography. Now then, interestingly, I did make a note, chapter 2. You don't have to understand physics to take good photographs, but understanding how light behaves and how lenses form into images gives you a broader view of the possibilities of photography. Well, I think any technical book that manages to make a comment like that, which is basically finding the boundaries between the technique and the creative, is definitely worth a jolly good read. Although in fairness, Langford's basic photography is more than a read, it's a study. Now, if you go through the chapters of the contents of basic photography and the different headings, what is photography, light, how images are formed, lenses controlling the image, etc., and so it goes on. I mean, immediately it tells you how this is obviously forming a foundation of photography and, giving you absolutely the in-depth basics as far as all the different aspects of the discipline are concerned. What's also good with Langford's basic photography and the advanced one as well is that it all ends in projects. Now, realistically, to do this book justice and to really understand all the concepts and ideas that are put across, I mean, I would expect anyone to be tackling this, probably over 6 months, 9 months, even a year, possibly longer. But I mean, typically it might take you a year to work your way through all the different chapters and all the contents and to do the exercises. And remember, it's not a running race. We're not trying to get to the finish line as quickly as possible. I mean, people, invest in photographic careers for several years before they kind of, like an apprenticeship as such, really. So it's several years of learning and bringing on this balance between your technical ability and your creative ability, which is reflected in your website and the work that you're producing. It's always that yin-yang, the balance of the two. As far as different editions of Langford's are concerned, I'm using the 9th edition here, and of Langford's advanced photography, I've got the 8th edition. I think there's newer versions of these, but as I say, these are perfectly adequate, and I bought these ones recently online to use for teaching, and I mean, obviously, because relatively speaking all this can add up. So Langford's Advanced and Langford's Basic Photography. But now also to talk specifically about a photographer, just to begin with, Jane Bown. Jane Bown was predominantly a black and white photographer, and she worked for a newspaper magazine called The Observer, and she was likened by another photographer called Lord Snowdon to be the British Cartier-Bresson, and certainly her photographs have the same resonance as Cartier-Bresson. So I thought that this would be a good photographer to introduce at an early stage. Jane Bown, this is one of her publications. It's her work 1947 to 1967. Jane, unfortunately, no longer with us. She died in her 90s, or late 80s, I think. The point being, really, with Jane, I was fortunate enough to meet her once. She came onto one of the films I worked with, and I did know her work, and it was interesting to observe her. The beauty of what she did was that she worked remarkably simply. She had been to college and studied photography, so she certainly had studied her craft, so she knew her discipline basically. But she worked with one camera, black and white film, and available light. I mean, that was her whole ethos, was this very simplistic approach to image making. So, I mean, if you think of the contrast now, where we are now, I mean, I was looking at a magazine earlier on about a photographer that was covering the inauguration of Joe Biden in America, and I mean, a phenomenal amount of equipment he was taking. And I think, well, Jane Bown, you couldn't get any simpler. Literally a camera, really one lens, she didn't even change lenses, available light, black and white film, and you know, probably a lot of the time she may well have processed that film and printed that film herself as well. So but the point being, she did obviously know her craft extremely well. So later on we may look closer at the work of Jane Bown, but at an early stage, that is somebody that is worth considering, who works very simplistically. I should also go back and say that in Langford's Basic Photography, and another interesting angle, another interesting concept, is that they do here talk quite a lot and introduce wet photography and black and white photography. I mean, chicken and egg, which one came first, you know? I mean, a lot of people now think that obviously, you know, to some extent, perhaps wet photography, analog photography, as it's sometimes referred to, is perhaps outdated. It's all about digital and instant photography, although interestingly enough, obviously a lot of the techniques, the ideas, the principles, even the references and technical references refer to wet chemistry, films, you know, chemicals, black and white and colour photography. I personally sit in any particular camp and favour one more than the other. I think that, relatively speaking, I think now wet photography mainly sits in the more artistic side and more artistic pursuit of photography, and that probably digital, relatively speaking, is much more geared towards commercial image making and the commercial production of images. But ultimately, you know, what are we actually concerned with? We are concerned with image making. So really and truly, it, as far as I'm concerned, is just another option. So I think it's a question of paying both things a fair amount of credence, both digital, the advancements in digital, and the concept of digital photography, and our wet photography and films, etc. I think they both need to be considered. One should, you know, gain a knowledge of both sides of it, so that you can say you have a completeness as far as a photographer is concerned. Because there may be at times during your career that different types of photography, either or the digital or the film photography could be applicable. So it's good, you know, to have a knowledge of both sides of it, really, and they both relate to each other. So yes. So I just want to put a little summary on this first episode. Self-motivation, I talked about self-motivation at the beginning of this video. The point I'm trying to make here is that as photographers, as people that will work, as creatives that will work on their own for a majority of your working life, you need to be motivation. Motivation is part of our repertoire, absolutely. And probably where it starts is with the will and desire to conquer the technical mountains, as it were, to get on top of this technical side of photography. Because again, I mean, using the analogy when I spoke about being able to understand, like a musician, for example, when eventually you've got on top of your technique and your technical ability, you'll be able to sort of pick up a rhythm, play with it, feel it naturally, which is what you really want with photography. And that's what we're all striving for. I mean, bear in mind that photography, it's a constant learning curve. I mean, for many, many years. I mean, I can't honestly say, even at my stage, nearly 40 years working in photography, oh, that I know everything, that I've done everything. No, I haven't. I mean, that's the excitement, that's the motivation that keeps you going. But there are certain milestones, certainly early on in a career, where you conquer certain aspects of photography, and you begin then to feel on top of it, and the confidence begins to grow. I mean, those key concepts are obviously, well, light. I mean, the understanding of light, and that's both daylight and artificial light. Cameras, lenses, the recording device, whether you're using digital or whether you're going down the wet chemistry route, and now obviously, yes, I mean, well, it's always been part of it, but post-production, that side of it as well. I mean, there are so many different attributes of photography that you really need to have a strong grasp of to really to begin to be a professional exponent of your craft. So I just wanted to underline those points basically about self-motivation and how important it is to, as I say, take on the skill or develop your ability of self-motivation. And why particularly I use Jane Bown as an example was, I suppose what comes with Jane Bown is I suppose a degree of irony, really, is that despite obviously an enormous knowledge of her craft and an understanding, she was someone, in my opinion, that really almost sort of took it back to basics in a way that she just literally operated with this immense amount of skill, this immense amount of compositional ability, and operated with one camera, one lens, often just an 85mm lens, and a roll of film. And as I say, I was fortunate enough to encounter Jane on one occasion, and I know that she was also renowned. I mean, she would shoot 1 or 2 rolls of film. I mean, I understand. I mean, she didn't shoot oceans. I mean, if you think now digitally, I mean, which is a criticism often in the professional world as well, is that the quantity of photography that professionals produce, I mean, it's just excessive. I mean, it's about knowing your craft, knowing your skill, focusing and concentrating and being able to produce 1 or 2 key images. And I think Jane Bown was certainly an absolute master exponent of that. Okay, thanks very much. Jane Bown. Right on. Great photos.